Hi. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. So today is actually a happy day for me. It's my birthday. And thank you. And it's not only my birthday, but I started teaching here at South Texas 6 years ago today. My first day teaching was my birthday in 2012, and now 6 years later, the calendar lines up. It's my birthday again. So my first day of teaching, I brought everyone cookies, and I've done it every semester since. So I have for everyone happy to start. Please pass these around. So cookies for everyone. You're welcome. It gets worse from here. Now it goes downhill from here very quickly. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I also have to pass around another free thing. This one's also good. Pocket constitutions. Bring these to class every day, please. Okay. Okay. These are good ones. Okay. And one more thing to pass around. This is the least fun. So I learn all of your names as quickly as possible. I have these little tent cards. So just write whatever you want me to call you, nickname, I don't care. So just fold these in half and pop them out and just write your name in big letters. If you have a nickname, I'll call your nickname. I don't care what it is. So please pass these around as well. Okay, thank you. And I got markers as well. And just make sure these get around. Okay. That's the formal part. And also an attendance sheet as well. Write your name on the attendance sheet. Thank you so much.
What was this?
The attendance roster, and write your name on the seating chart. Okay. So today is going to be an atypical class. Usually in class, I ask lots of questions and let you ask me questions. Today is an exception. I always start this class, constitutional law, by running through the entirety of our founding documents. The Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. Again, today is the anomaly. There are no questions to be taken. I'm going to run through this very quickly. I promise you'll have plenty of time. If I stop to take questions, I'll never finish. But I can do this in 2 hours, and I will. And let me explain why I'm doing this. Even though this class is called Constitutional Law, it's a small document. It can fit right in your pocket. It's very small. Our entire course of study will focus on maybe, 7 or 8 clauses of the Constitution. Like the Equal Protection Clause, and the Due Process Clause, and the Commerce Clause, like big stuff. But there's a lot of stuff in here we will never talk about again. But you need to know it. It's a shame for a person to graduate law school without having read the Constitution at least once. And that's what we're going to do today. So I have all the readings. I see all of your books, which is good. If you want to follow along in the little pocket constitutions, you can. We'll do the Declaration as well as the Constitution, or you can follow in your casebook, whatever you want. And one other point. I presume that you know nothing about American history. I presume you've never taken a class on American government, and you know nothing about government history. I just presume. Maybe you do, which is wonderful, but I presume you don't.
And I do that for a specific reason. Everyone here should be at the same level. Should all start at the same point.
I don't presume anyone has any advantages. Okay? And in case you're wondering, yes, this is on the exam. I can ask you stuff on the first day of class, so make sure you pay attention. You'll find out about this soon enough. So our story begins with July 4th, 1776. This is a date that most people know about hot dogs and fireworks, but has a significance. I suspect many of you heard of the Declaration of Independence, but you may not know exactly what it is. The Declaration of Independence was a legal contract. A legal contract. It established the reasons why the United States was separating from Great Britain. It's actually, if you think about it, a legal memo. It gives justification for why these actions are being taken. Okay? So it begins. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. The entire notion of these 13 United States, these were colonies, independent colonies that formed together as states. Now the first paragraph, the first two are fairly famous. No one reads beyond that, but the first two graphs are fairly famous. It says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which are connecting them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. If you didn't get it, just grab it later. Thank you. What is going on here? When you guys write a legal memo, what's the first thing you do? What's the rule, right? What's the statute? What's the precedent? What's the case law? Is there a statute that allows you to separate countries? Is there a common law precedent, a tort, if you will, of how you can separate countries? There's not. So the drafters of the Declaration were appealing to a higher law. A higher law. And this is specifically the law of nature and of nature's God. I'll leave you to figure out what exactly that law is. But this is the idea that there's some law that's even greater than the books of statutes that transcends it. But this law of nature and nature's God is what requires this separation. The next paragraph, though, is one you've probably all heard of. And it's one that's wrapped up in contradictions. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What does that mean? That these things are so obvious that don't even need to be said, but we'll say them anyway, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And of course, the contradiction, at the very time this was being written, slavery pervaded the nation. And indeed, it wasn't the case that all men were being equal. But by stating it, it became something to aspire to, which is an important point. Once you say it, then you can point out, hey, this is not true. That they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. The idea here is that we are given certain rights by our Creator, whatever those rights are. And that these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the next part people never read. People stop reading after that paragraph, right? You've probably never gone beyond that. It says, to secure these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men. This is a theory of government. Why do we have government? To protect these natural rights. That's the first and foremost responsibility of government, to protect these rights. And where does this power come from? The consent of the governed. The people establish governments in order to protect those rights. The next paragraph is where things get funny. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, that is destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new governments to protect their safety and happiness. So what's going on there? If a government fails its foremost duty to protect our rights, you got to change it. You alter or abolish it. Now, does this mean whenever the government does something you don't like, we go to the streets and start mobbing and throw tars and feather at people? No, no, no. You don't change it for what are called light and transient causes, small things. But here, the problems are so severe, they warrant an abolition of government. They write, when a long train of abuses and usurpations amounts to absolute despotism, that is tyranny, it is the right of the people to throw off such a government. Just think about this for a minute, though. The colonists who signed this were saying that their king, the King of England, King George, was abusing them and usurping their powers and was a despot. Think about that for a minute. They were signing their death warrants. They were signing their death warrants. The king could kill you for criticizing him in this fashion. So this was a very bold statement that they were willing to make. And he writes, We've been patiently suffering, but no longer. So then comes, the issue, right? You got the rule. Here comes your analysis. Just a memo, right? The history of the King of England is repeated injuries and absolute tyranny. Here are the facts to a candid world. They were making the case for why they were separating. It wasn't just they weren't happy. They were making a legal argument. So the remainder of the declaration, which I've numbered here, it's not numbered in your books, but I've numbered it here, is listing their grievances, Festivus style, right? You're listing your grievances of what you want to remedy. Some of these are fairly bad. Some of them seem pretty trivial, but they were at least important enough at the time to warrant inclusion. So what it says, he has refused his assent to the most wholesome necessary for the public good. What does that mean? The most basic right of the people is to govern themselves. That's it. As long as we can govern ourselves, we can make whatever laws we choose. But the king wouldn't let the colonists govern themselves. Any law passed in the colonies had to be given the assent, or basically the blessing of the king. And those permissions were withheld. And the second one makes the same point. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws. He suspended the laws and neglected them. What does that mean? We cannot govern ourselves. People has been forced to relinquish the right of representation. He has called legislative bodies at distant places again. He has dissolved representative houses, and he's refused others to be elected. Each of these first 5 grievances all concern the same item. The king has not let us govern ourselves, which is a very, very serious offense. He's prevented the population of these states. He basically blocked immigrants from traveling to the New World. He's prevented the establishment of the judiciary power. This is important. Number 9, he made judges dependent on his will. What does this mean? The king decides whether a judge gets his term renewed. And if a judge rules in a way the king doesn't like, you're fired. No independence of the judiciary. It's one of my favorites. He has erected officers, swarms of officers to harass our people. What is this? The custom inspectors. There were many taxes imposed by the king, and he would send his officers to inspect people, thinking they were paying their taxes, the precursor to the IRS, right? He has kept among us in times we standing armies. Today we have a large army that's existing for years and years. But at the time, that was considered dangerous. An army was only established at times of war, and then after the war, they went home. Okay? This one, people don't think much, but he has quartered large bodies of troops among us. This wasn't just a convenience, but also to keep an eye on people. To put a British soldier in your house means that soldier's watching what you were doing. And this is a reference to the Boston Massacre. When there were certain crimes committed, instead of trying people in the United States, the king would send them for trial in England, far away, where the jury would not be among their peers. He's cut off trade, imposed taxation without their representation, deprived us of trial by jury. He abolished the free system of laws and altered our government. He suspended our legislature, abdicated government. He plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, and burnt our towns. And this one's a little bit current. At the time this was being written, in July of 1776, the king had sent an army of Hessian mercenaries. Who are these people? Trained soldiers who were there to try and kill the Americans in the Revolution. He has taken captive of citizens in the high seas. And this one, he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rules of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of our ages. Was he saying? The English are working with the natives to terrorize us on the coast. Okay. So those are 27 bullets, right? These are the grievances that they put together. And then he comes to the conclusion, right? Iraq. Here's the conclusion. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress. We want a remedy, right? In humble terms. But our repeated petitions have been answered with only further injury. Then he comes to the crescendo. A prince whose character is thus marked, every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So he's saying, you, king, can no longer be our ruler. Was that? Adrian, was that?
I said it is 2018, so that was me.
There is nothing new under the sun, my friend. You will learn this. There's nothing new under the sun. Well, really, there truly is nothing new. Everything just sort of circles with new names, right? But Norman Wanting, to the British brethren, what's he saying here? The U.S. is about to go to war with Britain, but they're our brothers, right? One day they're brothers, and the next day they're enemies. He's saying we're trying to appeal to the native justice, the common kindred, our connection with the British people. But if it doesn't work out, enemies in war, in peace, friends. That's what it's going to be, war or peace. It's going to be a war. So therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, the creator, however you want to define that, say that these colonies are states. Just look what happens, right? In the same sentence, they start off as colonies, they become states. That's significant, right? They're no longer under the rule of the king. And all political connection are totally dissolved. So then what happens? These are free and independent states. They can levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, and establish commerce. They can do all things government can do. Now there's the final part. Again, they realize that they're probably going to die for this, right? They have no, I mean, we know in hindsight they won, but they didn't know that at the time. And they put out this message. We rely on the protection of divine providence, that is God, and we pledge to each other our lives, literally our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, that they're willing to put everything on the line for this noble project. There were 56 signatures, most famous, which is John Hancock. I can show you the picture of it over here. It's really faded, but if you see like a big low loop right there, that's the John Hancock signature. And again, they were signing their death warrants. There was no guarantee anyone would ever see the light of day after this. So that was, again, July 4th, 1776. And over the next 4 or 5 years, depending how you count, the United States was in a bitter war against Great Britain. And through only miracles to imagine, the United States prevailed. And eventually they reached a treaty of peace with the Brits. But winning's one thing. Governing is quite another. And that brings us to the second topic I want to talk about, which is the Articles of Confederation. Now, how many of you have heard of the Articles of Confederation before today? Oh, good. Okay, I'm happy to hear that. Okay, that actually makes me a little bit happy. Okay? So, shortly after the Declaration, the U.S. government, which was still very new, started to develop a frame of government. And this became known as the Articles of Confederation. But it wasn't finalized right away. The states had more important things to worry about. They were fighting a war. So by 1781, give or take the date, they finally agreed to this new form of government. And this was the first attempt at figuring out how to run a nation with 13 independent states, right? The history of this is important. Each of the states was considered its own, basically, country, right? You had New York, you had Pennsylvania, you had Virginia. States had different interests. The southern states focused on agriculture. Northern states focused on commerce and trade. There were different religions, even different languages. People spoke German in some states. And there was the idea of how do you create a single government that can work on top of this framework, this legacy of the British colonial system. And the first attempt is the Articles of Confederation. Now, in hindsight, it didn't work out. It barely made it 6 or 7 years. But it's important to study the Articles to know what were the failures of this document. Why was this frame of government inadequate? And how did our Constitution, which we have still today, remedy those errors. So let's just start at the beginning. It's a very fascinating document. It says, to all to whom those presents shall come, we, the undersigned delegates of the states affixed to our name, send greetings. They're saying, hey, we're a new country. Welcome. Come learn about us. And it's described as an Articles of Confederation. Now, what does this word confederation mean? People think, oh, Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, the Southerners, right, slavery. The word has a much simpler meaning. A confederacy, a confederation, is a league of states, right? Different states come together for a common purpose. It has a very negative connotation now, rightfully so, but the word itself is actually a lot more basic. It refers to a league of states. So these articles, what's an article? An article is a document, right? These documents which describe this league, this perpetual union, right? Just think about that for a second. They were really optimistic, right? They were thinking, okay, let's say this union lasts forever, maybe we'll be right. Didn't make it 6 years. Notice our Constitution that we have today does not have perpetual union language. Not so optimistic. They're saying, fingers crossed, hopefully this works out. Didn't quite make it. And then it lists the states: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay? So, the style, the name of the Confederacy. Okay? The name of the Confederacy is the United States of America. So what does that mean? What does that mean? We think today the United States of America is a country, right? Is, singular. But at the time, you would say the United States of America are a confederacy. The United States of America are in a confederacy. It was plural. It's not the United States is, it's states that are united are. You see the difference, right? It focused not on one collective union, but on each individual state. Okay? And what happens? Each of these states retains its sovereignty. What is sovereignty? Man, what a hard word. We'll spend a lot of time on this concept. I'll give you a preview. It means power. It means authority, right? Think of the king as the sovereign. It means power. So each state retains its power. What power? Think of it like this. On July 3rd, 1776, each of the states was under the king's sovereignty. They declared independence. The states then inherited whatever sovereignty the king had, right? Whatever powers the king had, now the states had. Okay? So the states have their sovereignty, their freedom and independence, unless it's expressly delegated to the new Congress. What does that mean? The states keep whatever power they had from the king unless they give powers up in this document, right? It's basically a forfeiture, right? We had these powers, but to form this perpetual union, we'll give some of them up. The idea is the central government, whatever it is, will have certain reserved authorities. Everyone with me? Okay? Next, it says, the said states enter into a firm league of friendship. It's like, the Justice League, right? What is this league of friendship? What is this, right? A league of friendship. What a strange way to describe a government. But that's exactly what it was. There was nothing binding them. It was all very loose and permissive. And what's this firm league of friendship? To protect their common defense, security of their liberties, the general welfare. Okay. Next, it says to better secure and perpetuate mutual friendship. Okay. And intercourse among the people of different states. The free inhabitants of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities. So here it comes, right? Didn't take 4 articles. Free. There's already one of your first references to slavery. This provision was designed to make sure a person going from one state to another receives certain privileges and immunities. You'll learn this word, but these refer to rights. The right to own property, right? The right to make contracts, the right to work. That if I am a resident of New York and I move to New Jersey can't deprive me of the same right to give its own citizens. But again, this only applied to free inhabitants, slaves expressly included. What this provision was trying to do was have a national economy, that people can move from state to state without being subject to barriers of this sort. Okay, that's Article 4. Then we have this provision. If anyone commits a crime in one state and then flees from justice, he can be delivered and removed back to his home state. This is again a reference to slavery, of what ultimately came known as the Fugitive Slave Clause, that slaves who run away can be returned. This was even in the very earliest days of the government. The Full Faith and Credit Clause, right? If I make a contract in New York, it will be given effect in New Jersey. Again, building a national economy of sorts. All right. Now, today we have a Congress, right? We have a House of Representatives, we have a Senate, we have an executive, right? We have the President of the United States. And then we have courts. We have the Supreme Court, and we have the Circuit Courts of Appeals and the lower courts, right? That framework didn't exist with the Articles. They had one Congress, only one House. And each state had one member. Each state had one vote. So the 13 states, each state had one vote. You can imagine that caused some problems. Because big little Rhode Island, which is like this big, and then Virginia, which I think was the biggest state, had the same representation in Congress. You can see why that causes some problems very quickly, right? And it says, no state shall be represented by less than 2, no more than 7, but each state has only one vote. And also each contains some delegations. What does that mean? The states pay their members Congress, not the central government. So the representatives are dependent on their states for their decisions. So you can say how they're going to vote. And indeed, if a state representative votes the wrong way, the state can recall their delegate, bring him back home. So you voted the wrong way. It's almost like an ambassador, right? The same way we send an ambassador to a foreign nation. And if that ambassador screws up, come back, you're wrong. That's how this government was envisioned. That the states, as basically independent nations, would send representatives to this Congress. They'd have a vote. If they screwed up, they'd bring them back home. They weren't part of a federal government the way we think about it today. Okay. Now, there were certain limitations on what the states could do. For example, states were not supposed to be engaging in foreign commerce. They weren't supposed to be sending ambassadors or making treaties or alliances, right? The reason why is the hope was that this new central government would handle foreign affairs and the states would handle local, domestic affairs. It makes sense. Didn't work out. The states quickly started negotiating treaties for trade on favorable terms. So the southern states for agriculture would make good trades for cotton, whatever their crops were, and the northern states would have textiles and various other mercantile things. Okay, so this didn't work out at all. Also, states were not supposed to impose taxes, tariffs, if you will, on imports. That was for the central government to do. States were not supposed to keep basically a navy, a vessel of war, right? It was the central government that was responsible for maintaining the armed forces, not the states. States can't engage in war without the consent of the United States and Congress. So again, there were certain functions that were seen as better suited for this central government, which at the time met in Philadelphia. Okay. Again, the states could appoint lower-level military officers under colonel, but then you'd have Congress appointing others. Okay. Now, here's where things started going wrong. Taxes. The article government had no effective means of collecting taxes. So it says, the taxes for paying the proportion shall be laid and levied by the authority and direction of the legislature of the several states. Think of that for a minute. The states were responsible for taxing themselves. All right? The states were responsible for taxing for the local matters and for the national matters. You think the states wanted to increase the taxes on their own people for this faraway government? Nope. So almost immediately, this became a nightmare because they ran out of money. They had no money to do anything because they didn't want to tax their own people. Some of the states paid, some of the states didn't pay. And the central government quickly ran out of money. Okay. Number 9. The United States will have the sole power of determining peace and war. Okay. This is one of my favorite provisions. Has anyone ever heard of a letter of marque and reprisal? No. This is a license to be a pirate. My favorite things in the world, right? The government can actually give you what's called a letter of marque, which allows you to basically commandeer ships at sea. The Captain Jack, right? Jack Sparrow, that is. This was a very common practice that the government would have. So the Congress could do these. Now, you've noticed so far that there's no mention of judiciary. The only courts that were established by the central government were courts for piracies. Again, piracy was actually very important back then. Why piracies? It happened in the seas, right? The waters. There was no clear jurisdiction of a state court to handle matters at sea. So they wanted to have courts for piracy. Okay? And what if there were disputes between states? For example, states disagreed on their boundaries, which is fairly common. Say you have a river between two states, you don't know where the boundary is. Congress would decide these disputes. There was no independent judiciary. And here are various hodgepodge measures that the government could do. They could mint coins, establish uniform weights and measures, establish post offices. Like, who cares about post offices, right? That's actually very important. It was the only way to send messages from one end of the republic to the other. It was a fairly significant idea. We don't care about today, but it's fairly important. Okay? So we've gone almost 20 minutes into this document. I have not mentioned the president yet. Yeah, I haven't. So trivia bit. Who was the first president of the United States of America? The answer is not George Washington. Was it? So you said it? You know the name? John Hanson. Who said that? Very good. Where'd you learn that? Someone did her homework. Good job. The guy's name was John Hanson. He's the first person elected president of the United States. Utterly irrelevant. I don't know what he did. I've looked into it. Didn't really do much, the guy. I'm sure he was a nice guy, but I don't know anything about him. Whatever. Because the person had no power, right? It references the office of the president. But this is more like an honorary position. There's no actual authority. So you basically had a central government with 13 states, each state with one vote, and that was it. There was no one person guiding the ship as the commander-in-chief, so to speak. It was destined to fail. And here's again the requisitions, right? All the taxes were just merely saying, please pay us. We request money. Did not work. Okay? All right. Any Canadians here? None? Okay. Well, we actually opened the door for Canada to join the Republic. They never took us up on it. Their loss or our loss. I don't know which one it is, right? But Canada was like, green light to join the Republic. Okay, now we get down. It says, every state shall abide by the determinations of the United States and Congress assembled. Okay? In other words, states, please listen to us, right? Please listen to us. And it says again, this union will be perpetual, wishful thinking. Okay? But here's the key point. Any alteration, any change, any amendment to this government has to be agreed to by the legislature of every state. 100%, right? 13 out of 13. You can't make any changes to our Constitution, to the Articles of Confederation without unanimous consent. I'll give you a preview. We didn't follow that, right? Our Constitution was ratified with the consent of 3/4 of the states. The very idea of our Constitution itself was unconstitutional because it didn't comply with the provisions of the Articles. Just keep that in mind. Then we come to the end, right? This is the IRAC. This is the conclusion, right? We appeal to the great governor of the world that these Articles of Confederation, we ratify and confirm them, that they should be inviolably, I can never say that word, inviolably observed, and the union shall be perpetual. 1778. It wasn't actually ratified until 81, but it was drafted that year. It didn't last maybe 5 or 6 years. So what happened? In the intervening years, in 1781, 82, 83, states stopped paying their taxes. States started erecting barriers to trade. States started negotiating treaties with foreign nations to get favorable terms for trade deals, right? And it became very quickly that this republic, or this confederacy, I should say, wasn't going to work out. So in 1787, about 6 years later, Congress authorized a meeting, a convention, to propose amendments to the Articles. Again, the purpose of this meeting in 1787 was to propose amendments that could then be voted on by this Continental Congress, by the Confederate Congress. They went a bit further than this, right? So during the hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, delegates met from, I think, 11 or 12 of the 13 states. I think 1 or 2 stayed behind. And again, their charge, right, their instruction was propose amendments. But very quickly, they decided to do something else, which is propose an entirely new form of government, which became the Constitution of the United States. And again, this was not to be ratified by all states. By its own terms, it became effective when ratified by 3/4 of the states. So I'm going to walk you through almost every clause of the Constitution. I might skip around a little bit, but I'm going to try and do all of them. I'm actually making very good time so far. You need to know this entire document, so pay close attention. There might be provisions here I don't mention again for this semester, but you need to know this. And just to give you a preview, my final exam last year, if I remember correctly, it said you're at the Constitutional Convention, right? Don't cite any cases afterwards. You're limited to what's in the Constitution, so you need to know this stuff very well. So the Constitution itself has 7 articles that were ratified in 17. Don't be afraid. I have very good hearing, by the way. I hear everything. So the Constitution was ratified in 1787. There were 7 articles. I'm sorry, it was proposed in 1787 and was ratified in 1789. So let's again clear. In 1787, the Constitution was proposed. It has 7 articles, 7 sections. It was ratified in 1789. That's when the requisite 9 states approved the document. 2 years later, in 1781, the Bill of Rights was ratified. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. That was 1791. Over the next 200-odd years, the Constitution will be amended a total of 27 times. We have 27 amendments now. We have the longest serving Constitution in the world by a lot. By a lot. It's also one of the shortest constitutions in the world. I can fit in my pocket. Most constitutions of governments around the world are very long with thousands of articles. Even the Texas Constitution has thousands of articles. You can't fit in your pocket. Okay? So our Constitution has actually changed very little in terms of length in 200 years. However, it's changed a lot based on how the Supreme Court has interpreted it. So even though this case is called constitutional law, much of what we do is studying how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution. But today, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. They're out of the picture. They don't exist yet. We're talking only about the Constitution. They'll screw it up later, right? We'll get there in a bit. But we're going to just talk about, they do some good stuff. But we're going to talk just about the text here. So let's start. 8:09, perfect timing. It begins, we the people of the United States, in order to form a perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. This is known as the preamble, right? The preamble is like the preface to the foreword. And this sets out a broad purpose of the Constitution. It doesn't have any teeth, though. It doesn't actually define government. And it has very little relevance in how the Constitution has been interpreted. But it's a very lofty aspiration of we the people. And of course, the very first three words has the same contradiction. Not all people were able to participate in the framing of this government. So then we start with the 7 articles, okay? You'll need to know this, so please put this in your notes. Article 1 of the government concerns the legislative branch, okay? Article 1 concerns the legislative branch. Article 2 concerns the executive branch. And Article 3 concerns the judicial branch. Remember that. 1 is legislative, 2 is executive, 3 is judicial. You'll need to know all 3 of these. Okay? So the very first aspect of forming a government creates the legislative branches. And it says it right here, Section 1, Article 1, Section 1. All legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. It will consist of a Senate and the House of Representatives. So under the Articles of Confederation, there was just one Congress, one body. But today, we have 2 branches. The Congress consists of a House of Representatives and a Senate. Okay? But I want to focus on the first 5 words, or 6 words. All legislative powers herein granted. What does that mean, herein granted? Congress only has the powers that the Constitution gives to it. The states had whatever powers were left over from revolution, right? Whatever powers the king had, those states have those powers. The states surrender some of those powers to Congress. They keep some, they give up a few. But Congress only has those powers that are granted in the Constitution. So basically the first 7 or 8 weeks of the semester, we'll be asking a question. Does Congress have the power to do X? Does the Constitution give Congress the power to do X? First, probably a couple weeks of the semester. Okay, move on. Article 1, Section 2. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every 2nd year. Okay? In other words, elections for members of the House every 2 years. Makes sense. Then it gives qualifications. To be a member of the House of Representatives, you have to be 25 years old and 7 years a citizen of the United States. Okay? Now we come to a clause that many of you probably have heard of, few of you have ever read, and even few of you understand it, but I'll walk you through it. It says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in the Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, again, there's that reference to free persons, including those bound to service for a term of 5 years, service for a term of years, excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Now, there's a lot going on here. I just want to focus the language, right? The Constitution never uses the word slaves. It doesn't use the word slavery. It uses phrases like other persons. This was deliberate. And this is not well understood, but the framers understood they were doing something bad, right? It's almost like you're in denial, right? You know you're doing something bad, so you just pretend it doesn't exist. So they wouldn't use the word slave in the Constitution. They could have. They could have put it in there. No one objected, but they didn't. And this argument was actually seized upon by abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, Lysander Spooner, among others, to say the Constitution doesn't even mention slavery, therefore it can't be required by the Constitution. It was a very powerful decision not to use the word slaves. But let's talk about what this provision actually does. First 3 words. Representatives and taxes. Population is important. The more people a state has, the more representation it gets in the House. right? So today, Texas has what, like 40 members of Congress, and Wyoming has like 1, right? Why? Population matters. So here is the issue. What would have happened to the southern states if they counted all their slaves towards their population? They would have had a much bigger representation in Congress. So this is going to blow your minds. The southern states wanted to count 100% of their slaves to make the representation as big as possible. It was the northern states that said, no. Let's reduce the number of slaves counted. Otherwise, the South would have dominated in Congress. Let me tell you why that matters. The fugitive slave trade, right? At the time, you had the slave trade. Slaves were brought in from the Indies, from Africa, etc. That could only be abolished by statute. Had the southern states maintained this monopoly in Congress, would not have been repealed. So the thing that people don't quite get is it was the northern states who recognized the danger of counting slaves as 100%. That's why they were treated as 3/5. It's an immoral concept, but the northern states recognized they needed it. So the trade was this. We'll count them for less for population and for taxes, because taxes were apportioned based on the head. So the southern states paid less taxes, which maybe they liked. The slaves weren't going to pay taxes anyway. But they also had less representation. This was the compromise they reached. It wasn't a good compromise. Now, a couple years ago, the Congress said, we're going to read the entire Constitution, right? The same I'm doing now. No one wanted to read this clause. No one wanted to read it. It's in there. You have to read it. You can't forget about these things, but you have to understand why it's there. Okay, move on. The next thing is the census, right? We have the census every 10 years. This was a very important point. We had this annual decennial, every 10-year census to determine how many people are in each state. That way you can apportion the members of Congress accurately. Okay. We have this reference. The House has the power of impeachment. To remove an officer of the United States, or the president, for example, it's a 2-step process. The House impeaches them. That's basically like lobbying charges. The House says, we allege the president or someone else did something bad. What happens next? A trial happens in the Senate. So the impeachment process begins in the House, and the Senate has a trial. We'll get there later a little bit more. Okay, move on. Article 1, Section 3. This provision defines the Senate. Now, the Senate differs from the House in a few different ways. First, the terms of House members is 2 years. The terms of senators is 6 years. Members of the House were elected by the people. Senators were selected by the state legislatures. That was changed by amendment, but as originally designed, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. House representatives based on population. Bigger states had more members. The Senate was fixed. Each state had exactly 2 senators. And this was a very important compromise, right? How do you make everyone happy? Under the old government, Virginia and Rhode Island had the same representation, right? But now you have one house based on population, and the other house was a fixed number. So you have something for the big states to be happy about, the House, and something for the small states to be happy about, the Senate. But this is a very undemocratic form of government, right? That, Rhode Island would have the same number of senators as Virginia, this huge state. And one other point I'll get to later, how do you select the president? You have the Electoral College. How do you determine the number of votes the state has? You add up the number of senators and representatives. So if a state has 2 senators and 1 representative, that's 3 votes. If they have 50 representatives and 2 senators, that's 52 votes in the Electoral College. To this day, small states have such an advantage in the Electoral College. Their votes are weighted much more heavily. California, this humongous state, its votes are worth a lot less in the Electoral College than like Wyoming, for example. I don't need to pick on Wyoming. I think it's the least populous state. It's pretty small, but it's a big state, but not very populous. All right, I move on. Qualification for senator: 30 years of age, and 9 years a citizen. Think about this for a minute. Constitution was drafted in 1787. Who was a citizen for 9 years since 1787? Ooh. Ooh, when did you start counting? Declaration? You asked me? Okay. Next. Whoa, who's this? Vice President of the United States. Who's this officer? Where did this come from? So the Vice President is a fairly useless office. Doesn't do very much. John Adams said it was the most irrelevant office ever contrived by man. John Nance Garner said it wasn't worth a bucket of spit. He was right. But one job the VP has, it's true. One of the few jobs he actually has is he serves as the President of the Senate. He presides. And if there's a tie, he has a vote. He can break a tie vote. It's fairly rare that this happens, although it's happened quite a bit in the last couple of years. But generally, the Vice President does nothing. Just doesn't really have any responsibilities. I mentioned this before. The Senate has the sole power to try impeachments. In the case of an impeachment, the Senate turns into a court, and they actually have a trial to remove people. And if the president is being impeached, the Chief Justice presides. Wait a minute, who's the Chief Justice? Our new government creates his judiciary. And this person called the Chief Justice, which apparently exists just now, will preside. To remove an officer, you have to have 2/3 vote. So you can't have a simple majority. It takes a lot to remove a person from office. It's not supposed to be easy. And again, we have elections every 2 to 4 years. So any bad officer will get voted out soon enough. Section 4. Yeah.
When it says 2/3 vote, does that mean 2/3 of just the Senate or Congress?
2/3 of the Senate.
Okay.
2/3 of the Senate, yeah. The House only needs a majority to impeach, but the Senate can remove with 2/3 vote. Understand? Thank you. So the next provision, Article 1, Section 4. The states still regulate elections, but Congress can intervene if needed. Okay, Section 5. The House is a judge of its own elections. That is, if a person shows up at Congress saying, haha, I was elected by the people of, whatever town you're from, Congress decided were you actually elected. Okay? There's also a way to kick out members of Congress. Members of Congress can't be impeached. There was debate about that, but today it's pretty well established. Members of Congress can't be impeached. Instead, they can be expelled by a 2/3 vote. So if there's a member of Congress that really screws up, disorderly behavior, the House can expel them in a 2/3 vote. It's happened a fairly small number of times in American history, very rare. Okay? This was a fairly important provision. Neither house can adjourn without the consent of the other. In other words, say one house wants to frustrate the other because, peace, we're gone. We're gone. They can't leave town unless the other house agrees to it. It's a fairly important provision to keep them both working in sync. Okay? Article 1, Section 6. Salaries are not paid by the states. The salaries of members of Congress are paid by the federal treasury, the U.S. Treasury. This is a change. In the articles, the states pay their salaries. So now, again, they don't have divided loyalties. They don't have to depend on the states to pay their way. They can perhaps vote independently. Maybe. Okay? Members of Congress can't be arrested while they're in Congress. That would be a bad thing. And also, they can't be punished for their speeches or debates, right? You can't throw someone in jail for things they say on the House floor. You want to have a freedom for them to do that. Okay? The word, which you may know now, called the Emoluments Clause. There are several emoluments clauses. What this basically means is that Congress can't create an office and then someone who votes for it serves in that office. So, if I vote to create the secretary of whatever, I can't then serve as a secretary. Or if I vote to increase the salary of this position, I can't then be appointed to that salary. So it's a very good provision, I think. Okay, now here comes the money. Taxes. One of the biggest failings of the Articles of Congress was there was no way to requisition money. No way to require taxes. But the House can pass bills to raise revenue, not the Senate, the House. House is closer to the people. But the House can pass bills to raise money. What's a bill, right? Schoolhouse Rocks, you've seen it, right? How does something become law? Yeah, I'm just a bill sitting on the steps of Capitol Hill, right? You remember this song, right? You start in the House. Right? You start in the House. The House passes a bill by majority vote. Then it goes to the Senate. Senate also passed by majority vote. Then it's presented by the president. If the president signs it, it's law. If not, it's called a veto. And the veto can be overridden with a 2/3 vote of each house. So we have a very strict method of passing laws. A bill starts in one house, pass majority vote, go to the other house, majority vote. It start in either house generally. Then it goes to the president, presented to him. If he signs it, it's law. If he doesn't sign it, it's a veto, but they can override it. This makes lawmaking really tough. Think about it, because you have to appeal to the House, which is based on population, and the Senate, which is based on a fixed number per state, and then the president. We don't have a system of government that makes law passing easy, right? In other governments around the world, it's very easy to pass a law. You have one house, maybe. President might have to sign it. We have a very tough process, and that was by design. Okay, move on. Aha. We get to the mother. Article 1, Section 8. We will spend the first, half of the semester on this one provision. I'm not kidding. We spent like maybe 4 or 5 weeks on one clause here. Earlier I said Article 1, Section 1. All legislative powers herein granted. Remember I said that? I flagged that for you. Almost all the powers granted come from here. Article 1, Section 8. So if I ask you, where does Congress get the power to do something? You have no idea. Just take a guess. You say, Professor Blackman, Josh, right here, Article 1, Section 8, and you're basically half right, right? You should probably be right almost half the time. So if you know nothing else, say Article 1, Section 8, okay? Then you're at least, on the right track. You're probably still wrong, but you get yourself on the right track to get the answer. This provision lists or enumerates like a number, right? Enumerates Congress's enumerated powers. When I say enumerated powers, I mean they're listed. Congress only has powers that are listed here. They're almost all in Section 8. There are a couple scattered elsewhere, but they're almost all here. And it lists, what's the number? I always say it's 17. 17, yeah. It lists 17 different clauses. We'll spend, again, weeks and weeks on like 3 of these clauses, but you need to know all of them. So let's start. What is the very first power? The very first power listed. It was designed to correct the failings of the Articles of Congress. It says, number 1, to lay and collect taxes. This is a big deal. That Congress doesn't have to simply ask for money. They can just impose the taxes themselves and collect it. To pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Okay, big deal. Number 2, Congress shall have the power to borrow money. Congress shall have the power to borrow money. This was designed to establish the credit of the United States. We were a young nation. If any of you saw the Hamilton musical or know about it, this was one of Alexander Hamilton's greatest contributions to establish credit for the United States. Because when you have credit, other countries are invested in you and they want to see you succeed, so they give you more money. It's a very, it's a process. Then we get to clause 3. We'll spend, I think, 5 weeks on this one sentence, right? Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So as a threshold matter, if Congress can do something, what does that mean for the states? They can't do it. If Congress can do X, that means the state cannot do X. More importantly, if Congress passes a law doing X, and the states pass a law that says the opposite, the state law is invalid. So by saying that Congress can regulate commerce with the foreign nations, they're saying, states, you can't regulate commerce with foreign nations. And if Congress passes a law regulating interstate commerce, as commerce among the several states, that means a state law that regulates interstate commerce is put. You can't have these artificial trade barriers that the states were erecting. As well with the Indian tribes, this was a fairly important issue back then. Now, what does commerce mean? We'll spend so much time on this. But originally, as originally understood, commerce meant intercourse, not those dirty words like, exchange of goods, trade, right? It always happens. Always one guy last, right? Don't be dirty, right? Well, when we get to the First Amendment, some dirty stuff coming. This is actually fairly neat. But it meant intercourse, trade, exchange. Did it mean all economic activity? Not quite. Okay. Number 4, Congress has the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Exactly what naturalization means is actually subject to debate, but it meant something like immigration, right? The states weren't handling naturalizing citizens. It was up to the central government to do that. As well, bankruptcies. Who cares about bankruptcies? Lots of states would pass laws that would just eliminate debt. Say, you know what? If you have debt, we're going to wipe it out. Those are very popular laws, but the banks hated them. So Congress has uniform law for bankruptcy. Also, Congress can coin money. You don't think about this, but back then each state had its own currency. A lot of this currency was basically worthless. It was paper, script, wasn't worth anything. So you have a national currency, which is usually backed by gold or other metal. And what happens if you counterfeited federal currency? Congress could pass a law to punish it. So if you made fake coins, Congress can go after you. Again, establishing post office and post roads, important. Congress can promote the sciences, useful arts by granting patents. Right, we still have this today. This is a very pro-economy document. It recognized why you need to have a central system for certain economic matters. Congress has the power to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. Whoa, what's the Supreme Court? Well, we get there later in Article 3, but this creates the idea of courts, federal courts. Now, the Constitution only creates one Supreme Court. It creates one Supreme Court. But Congress can create the lower courts if they so choose. They didn't have to. More stuff on piracies. Congress can punish piracies and various felons in the high seas. I know this seems very esoteric, but it was very important back then. They were very worried about pirates. Again, Congress can declare war, not the states. Also, Congress can grant letters of marque and reprisal. These are the pirate licenses. One of my students a couple years ago got me a letter of marque and reprisal. It's hanging in my wall. It's very cool. It's fake. She got it on Etsy, but it was very cool. So I can't be a pirate with it, but it does just hang in my wall. Okay? Congress raises and supports armies. Okay? But here's an important clause. Appropriations last more than 2 years. Why 2 years? Because every 2 years you have an election. Congress can't spend money beyond its term, right? You can't say, oh, we'll spend money for the next 20 years. No, you can limit it to 2 years, and that must be approved thereafter. Congress maintains the Navy. Congress can call forth the militia. Okay, more on the militia. Congress also has what's called exclusive legislation. What does that mean? What we have today is a federal capital. The District of Columbia is a federal city, basically. And they have a government, but it's not really a government because Congress can legislate over them. Then we get to number 17. This is probably the most important one in the entire list. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, sometimes called the Elastic Clause. I'll read it for you. It says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers, and all their powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So let me give you a very easy example to understand this. We know that Congress has the power to establish post offices and post roads. Okay, so they have a power to establish post offices and post roads. Does Congress have the power to purchase wagons and horses and hire letter carriers and people to go along those roads? How do you know that? Is there a horse clause of the Constitution? Is there a letter carrier clause? Is there a clause saying you can buy wagons? So we go down to number 17. And we can say, in order to establish post roads, it's necessary. You got to have horses, right? To have a postal system, you got to have wagons. It's necessary. To have a postal system, you have to hire letter carriers. It's necessary. And these are proper ways of running it. Again, it's both necessary and proper. We'll get there later. But this sweeps in other stuff. That you have the enumerated power, established post offices, and then you have, around it, stuff you can do that's necessary to get there. You'll read in the very first important case in McCulloch versus Maryland for Wednesday, how the court interprets necessary and proper. By the way, I linked to videos, short videos for each case. Please watch those. They will make your life a lot easier. They're linked right in the syllabus. Just make sure you watch it. They're very good. Okay? And if you can't get to email me, you should be able to. So the necessary and proper clause is very important. Okay, now we go on. Article 1, Section 9. Here we have, again, the migration and importation of such persons. Again, they don't use the word slaves. They use other persons, such persons. Everyone knows what they're talking about. There's no doubt who they're talking about. But it says the migration or importation of such persons. This is the slave trade, right? This wasn't, people were migrating on their own. They were being traded. This migration shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to 1808. What does this mean? For 20 years, the slave trade will not be touched. For 20 years, the slave trade will not be touched. This was another compromise. They realized we can't do this now. Who knows we'll even be here in 20 years? Let's just table this. Let's kick it off, punt it for 20 years. This is why the population matters. If the southern states counted all of their slave population, it would have never been repealed. I've done the math on this. There's no way. Right? It wouldn't have been repealed. There'd been too many slaves imported. So it's an important provision. But again, the slave trade's gone. Next, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall be suspended. Habeas corpus, which literally means like delivering the body or showing me the body, right? If someone is being confined, they have the right to challenge their confinement before a judge. This is a very old writ. Next, Congress can pass a bill of attainder or ex post facto. What the hell is a bill of attainder? A bill of attainder is a legislative bill that punishes one person. It says, you know what? We vote that Josh Blackman is guilty of a crime. He goes to jail. Those are common in England, right? Perhaps. You can't have bills of attainder. What's an ex post facto law? Use the example. Let's say you drive down the road, speed limit's at 65, you're driving 65. Tomorrow, they say, you know what? Just kidding. The limit's actually 55, and we're going to change it retroactively. You can get a ticket. Can't do that. Right? So no ex post facto laws. Okay? Next, Congress can't spend money unless there's an appropriation, that is, money is withdrawn from the U.S. Treasury. All right? Congress can't grant titles of nobility. Okay? And there's also prohibitions on officers from accepting emoluments, which very much in doubt. These are some sort of things of value. We'll maybe argue later exactly what they are, from foreign nations. Okay, Article 1, Section 10. This puts limits on the states, right? So the states, by joining this Constitution, surrender certain powers, and they also agree to certain limits. For example, states can't enter into treaties with foreign nations. States can't give letters of marque and reprisal, so no state pirates, unfortunately, right? States can't pass bills of attainder. They can't pass ex post facto laws. States can impair contracts, right? This is actually an obligation on states. They cannot violate the obligation of contracts, right? This is probably the most important provision of the early republic. Now it doesn't really matter much, but it was very important. And states can't grant titles of nobility. Okay, scrolling down. Okay, we are done with Article 1, right?
Article 2. Again, Article 2 concerns the executive branch. And it starts Article 2, Section 1. Okay? Article 2, Section 1. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. Now, I want you to look at the language here very carefully. It says, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. What is the executive power? Now, contrast that with the beginning of Article 1. Scroll back up. Article 1, Section 1. It says, all legislative powers herein granted.
So Congress only has the powers that are granted, but the president has the executive power. Here's the big difference. Congress's powers are enumerated. They're listed. Section 8. There's 17 clauses, right? Congress's powers are enumerated. The president's powers are not enumerated. He has the executive power. Now, some of them are listed, but they're not limited to those in the Constitution. So it says, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. Yeah, this is not John Hanson, this worthless guy who doesn't do anything, right? This is an actual, legit president with some oomph. He has a term of 4 years. There were proposals for the president to serve for life, like a king. No, 4-year term. And how is he appointed? Through a process known as the Electoral College. And I won't walk through the details, but the short answer is the Electoral College is determined based on how many representatives and senators the state has. You add those together, and that works. We do not have a popular vote for president. Okay? We have requirements. The president must be a natural-born citizen. One of the favorite law professor questions, is someone born through cesarean section a natural-born citizen? That's one of the favorite questions. There it is. Yeah, blow your mind right first day of class. And they must also be a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. Okay? If the president can't discharge his duties, the vice president becomes president. And this has happened a number of occasions in American history. The president's salary is fixed. You can imagine a situation where Congress says, hey, president wants more money, vote, sign our bill into law. So the president's salary is fixed. It can't be increased or decreased during his term of office. The president can only receive that salary. Okay? And the oath of office, which has been said by every president since Washington, says, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This is a very important thing to put it right in the document. Now we go to Article 2, Section 2. It lists some of the responsibilities of the President. He's the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. He can issue pardons for federal offenses. He can't pardon state offenses, only federal offenses. The President can make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. What does that mean? The President can negotiate a treaty with a foreign nation, but the Senate must vote on it. 2/3 must approve. The President can also nominate various officers of the United States, ambassadors, judges of the Supreme Court. He can appoint them, but not by himself. The Senate must give its consent to his nominees by majority vote. Treaties are 2/3, but appointing officers is a 50% vote, basically 50% plus 1. Okay? The President can also fill up various vacancies. So say the Senate is in recess, the President can fill up any vacancies. We'll have a case in this called Noel Canning, very complicated case. We'll do this later today. Okay? The President can give the State of the Union. He can convene both houses of Congress. And he has a duty to take care the laws are faithfully executed. So a provision which people slowly focus on in recent years. Okay. What if the President is not doing his job well? He can be removed from office through impeachment. Same for the Vice President and all the officers of the United States. Okay. That's Article 2. If you notice, it's a lot shorter than Article 1. Article 1 is very precise. It lists specific 17 clauses, right? This, I did in 5 minutes. It's fairly open-ended. This has led to a number of debates because the powers of the presidency are not clearly defined. And there's been a never-ending struggle between the Congress and the presidency over what those powers are. Let me tell you something. In any long-term battle between the executive and the Congress, the president's going to win. Why? There's one president and 500 members of Congress. 500 members can't get their act together. One president can. So in these long-term struggles, power accretes, power moves toward the executive at the expense of the legislature. It's the story of our republic for 200 years. Okay? Moving on. Article 3. Again, Article 3 concerns the judiciary, the courts. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were no federal courts. But now there will be. Article 3, Section 1, it says, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. What is the judicial power? It does not define it. Right? It doesn't define what the executive power is, and it doesn't define what the judicial power is. It leaves it open for us to discover, I suppose. And this power is vested in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's created by the Constitution. That's important. Congress cannot pass a statute to abolish the Supreme Court. Can't do it. They can abolish the lower courts, easy, but they can't abolish the Supreme Court. But this judicial power is also vested in such inferior courts as the Congress from time to time may ordain and establish. What does that mean? Congress can create lower courts. And when it creates lower court, the court has the judicial power. Now, who are these judges? We know they're appointed by the president, and they're confirmed with the consent of the Senate. So the president, can't put judges on by himself. The Senate must approve them. Okay? And judges hold their office during good behavior. This is not like England, where judges can be fired if the king doesn't like their rulings. They serve they served in good behavior, and their salaries are fixed. They cannot be diminished. They also don't have to be increased. The judges often complain their salaries are not increased enough, whatever, but they can't be decreased with inflation, basically the same. But they can't diminish their salaries. Okay. Now, you've actually studied Article 3, Section 2 in Civ Pro. You just don't know it, right? All of the bases of federal court jurisdiction, diversity, federal question, remember this stuff? Yeah, comes from here. Yeah, bring back flashbacks, right? Well, we will focus on diversity jurisdiction quite a bit. It's very important. So it says, the judicial power shall extend to all cases and controversies, right? For example, between citizens of different states. Diversity jurisdiction, that's where it comes from. Did you learn that? I heard him hearing yes and no, which is troubling. That's where diversity jurisdiction comes from, right? It says it right there. Okay? You also have this provision. Hold on, let me just highlight it for you. I'm sorry. Where is it? Highlight. There we go. Okay, thank you. You also have cases that are arising under the laws of the United States. Sound familiar? Arising under jurisdiction, federal question. That's where it comes from. So again, everything starts here. The Supreme Court just screws stuff up later, but everything starts here very basically. So the federal courts would have jurisdiction with diversity to give a fair forum, so you don't have a local bias, and also for federal questions, right? If you have a federal law, you want it to be resolved in federal court. Okay. Pay attention to this provision for your reading for next class, which is Marbury versus Madison. It says, in all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and those which a state shall be a party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. What does that mean? You can file a case right in the Supreme Court at the outset. But those are fairly limited. In all other cases, the court has only appellate jurisdiction. So ask yourself this question. If I am Guy, let's say my name is William Marbury, and I want my job as a judge, can I sue for it in the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction? To be determined on Wednesday, but keep that in mind later. We also have the protection of trial by jury. All right, moving on. Okay, again, Article 3 is fairly short. It doesn't do that much. It leaves a lot to be fleshed out by the courts, as it were. Now, Articles 4 through 7 are a bit of a hodgepodge. They don't have any clear categories, but I'll go through them one at a time. Article 4, Section 1 is called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. This was actually also in the Articles of Confederation, that if there's a contract or record passed in one state, it must be honored in another state. Good things. Section 2. This is the Privileges and Immunities Clause. I said these privileges and immunities are rights. That if you are a citizen of New York, you get all the privileges and immunities if you move to New Jersey. You can't be denied those rights. But again, Citizen. Right? Citizen. Were slaves citizens? Were freed slaves citizens? Ooh. We'll get to there with Dred Scott. One of the biggest arguments in Dred Scott was about this clause. Because if you were a freed slave and New York said you're a citizen, do you then get these rights? Huge debate on this. We'll get there later. But there was a huge moral and philosophical debate about whether the freedmen, not just the actual slaves, but freedmen, there were freed slaves, could have these privileges and immunities. Very important question. Okay? The next two clauses, again, concern slavery, but they don't use the name. So it says, no person held for service or labor. Slaves, right? If they flee, they should be delivered back. This was about runaway slaves. We'll do a case, I think, next week called Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which involves the Fugitive Slave Act. So pay attention to this provision when we get there, right? Okay, now move on. Article 4, Section 3. The framers recognized that the map of the United States was very small on the East Coast, but there was a lot of land out yonder, out west. So there was a provision that states can be admitted. See, Canada's not mentioned. Their offer's gone. It's off the table. They're not welcome anymore, right? They had their shot. They blew it. Okay. Article 4, Section 4 is called the Guarantee Clause. The Guarantee Clause. Very obscure. It doesn't come up very much. But it says that the United States guarantees every state a Republican form of government. This doesn't really have much weight anymore, but if a state became, a dictatorship, presumably Congress could intervene to prevent that. Okay. Article 4, done. Article 5 is very important. Article 5 is the process by which this document can be amended. Right? We've only had 27 amendments in 200 years of history. There have been thousands of proposed amendments, but only 27 have made it through the hurdle. So how do you amend our Constitution? It's not easy, my friends. A couple things have to happen. First, 2/3 of both houses have to agree on an amendment. Then 3/4 of the states have to approve it. So for an amendment to pass, you need 75% of the states to agree. Can the states agree on anything? Not really. I often joke, will there ever be an amendment ratified in your lifetime? So, actually, you're good. So I can't do it with my day students, but I can do it with you. So the 27th Amendment was ratified in 1992. When I say this to day students, how many of you were born after 92? Almost all their hands go up now. It didn't used to be, but so if you were born before 92, you lived through an amendment. Congratulations. I don't forget another one, but we'll talk about this later. Yeah, bless your hearts, as they say. Look, I started teaching again 6 years ago. I'm older now than I was then, but it's the thing about this job is I get older, but students stay the same age, right? Because the average age stays the same, so the gap just keeps growing and growing. I started teaching my 28th birthday. It was my 28th birthday. I'm 34 today. But that gap was pretty small, and that gets a little bigger. Yeah, I got better, by the way. It wasn't, it's hard doing this, especially at 9:30 at night. But I'll make it fun. I promise. This will be a fun class. So that's the process to amend. No, it's sweet fun. You're gonna have fun. No, this is energy. It's gonna be entertaining. Article 6. We're moving along. We're almost there. Article 6. The debts contracted before the adoption will be valid. And this is probably the most important sentence in the Constitution, without a doubt. The Constitution and laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Without this clause, the entire damn thing falls apart. Everything just it unravels like a ball of yarn. Without this one provision, it falls apart. Why? It says without any equivocation that a state cannot pass a law that conflicts with the Constitution of the United States or federal statutory law. The Constitution is the higher power. And if a state passes a law, it's underneath it. It's subordinate to it. You cannot have this sort of conflict. And how is this going to be enforced? The judges in every state are bound by this federal law. So you hear lots of debates, oh, there's no judicial review in the Constitution. Yeah, there is, right? It's a job of the judges to ensure the higher law prevails, the law of the Constitution, the law of federal law, which trumps any conflicting state law. Again, if this sentence wasn't put in, the entire thing would fall apart pretty quickly. Okay. Now we get to Article 7. We're almost done with the Constitution, right? Last article. The ratification of 9 states will be sufficient to establish this Constitution. Wait a minute, Josh. Wait a minute. Didn't we tell a few minutes ago with the Articles of Confederation, you have all the states, all 13? Yeah. The Constitution says we're good at 9. It doesn't matter what the other 4 say. You see a problem there, right? Now, once the 9 states ratified, oh God, which was the 9th state? Was it Virginia or was it? Let me check that. It was Virginia. I might be off. But once the 9th state ratified, ball game was over, right? Little Rhode Island can't exist by itself. That was a rebel state. They were very recalcitrant. Rhode Island was one of the last ones to ratify, but they can't exist by themselves. So what happens to the other 4 states? They basically have to go along. One other factoid: when the first Congress met in 1789, 2 states hadn't ratified yet. Congress met and started doing stuff without 2 states even present. I think it was North Carolina and Rhode Island. Check on that. I think those are the 2 states, right? They just weren't there. Government started. You snooze, you lose, right? They started their government. So having this less than unanimous consent was a big deal. It was a huge deal. All right, we move on. So again, Constitution proposed in 1787, and between 1787 and 1789, it was ratified by 9, then 10, then 11, eventually 13 states came along. But during the ratification debates in the states, when the states considered it, right, they all had suggestions. They said, you know what, this document's good, but we need to make some changes. And they said, we want an addition of certain amendments. So in the very first Congress, in 1789, several amendments were proposed. There actually were 12 proposed amendments, only 10 of which were ratified. And indeed, what we call the First Amendment, which we'll do in a minute, was actually the 3rd proposed amendment. Because it's First Amendment because it's first most important. It's actually 3rd, right? The first 2 are fairly unimportant, right? The first one concerned how districts were drawn up, and the second one concerned congressional pay. Now, fun fact, turn to the 27th Amendment in your Constitution. Okay, it should be on the very last page. We're close to it. Just shout the page number. 89. You see the little footnote there? It says, Congress submitted the text of the 27th Amendment to the states as part of the proposed Bill of Rights on September 1789. The amendment was not ratified with the first 10 amendments. Instead, it was ratified in 1992. What? Right? So this was actually one of the first proposed amendments. It didn't make the cut in 1789 or 91. So it just sat around for a couple hundred years. And I'm not joking. There was actually a student, I think he was at UT Austin, Google me on this one, I think he was at UT Austin, who wrote a paper on this in the 70s. He had a C on it saying, look, we can still amend the Constitution. We can still ratify it. We can just add more states. And eventually they added more states. So the most recent amendment, number 27, was actually proposed back in the 1790s. Remarkable. I don't think it's constitutionally totally bogus. I think it's invalid, but my opinion doesn't really matter. But I don't think you can count like that. I think it's time lapsed a long time ago. But anyway, the First Amendment proposed, irrelevant. So our First Amendment is actually 3rd, but we'll number them as they are in the Constitution.
Which one was this? The one that
It was either 1 or 2. I can't remember. I think it was 2.
was it?
I think it was the second proposed amendment. You can check it. It's either 1 or 2. I'm drawing a blank. Okay? But for sure, this was number 3. That one I can tell you with certainty. Okay? So we will spend a total of 2 classes on the First Amendment. What? Right, this is right. All you know about the Constitution, First Amendment. I am teaching a class in the spring on the First Amendment, which you should take. You should take it. But we only have time to cover it very briefly in ConLaw 1. Laughing? No? No good? No. Okay, well, you'll learn. You'll learn about the First Amendment very briefly, though. So the First Amendment has what are called the 5 freedoms. Begins, Congress shall make no law. Wait a minute. Just Congress? Can the states violate your free speech? Until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, only applied to Congress. They did not limit state power. You read a case for Wednesday called Barron versus City of Baltimore that holds that. But it begins, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. What does that mean? Well, today it means the government must be neutral towards religion, but originally it had a very different meaning. It meant that Congress can't screw up state churches. States had established religions. States had official churches. And this said that Congress can't make a law with respect to the state churches. Right? It had nothing to do with neutrality. It's a modern invention. Right? There's nothing about walls of separation in the Constitution. This came much later. Okay? Congress can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. This is referred to rights of conscience. Congress cannot abridge the freedom of speech. What is speech? Is it written? Is it spoken? Refers to files on the internet. What does it mean to abridge? Who is the press? Printing press? Newspapers, TVs, bloggers, tweeters? Congress can't violate the right of the people to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. What does that mean, to assemble? Can you associate with whomever you want? What does it mean to petition the government? Can you tweet at the president? This is actually a thing now. I didn't used to have it, but it's a thing now, right? So that's the First Amendment. We'll do a little bit more at the end of class. The Second Amendment, regrettably, I have no time to cover it, so I'll cover it very briefly. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Right? The Supreme Court didn't give a definitive answer of what this meant until 2008, and it was a very sharply divided 5-4 decision. There are the 2 clauses. The first part about the importance of the militia, and the second part, the right of the people. Does this protect the right only of the militia, or is it an individual right? What are arms? What does it mean to not infringe it? We have a very good chapter on the Second Amendment. You're welcome to read it, but I don't have time to cover it. We have so much to cover. ConLaw should be a 2-semester class, not a 1-semester class. There's no way I should fit this into 4 hours. It really should. There's way too much to cover. In most law schools, you have 6 hours of ConLaw, not 4. But we have only 4 here, so you have to move quickly, which is why the readings are tighter than you like. But you'll learn something. This will be very useful for you in the long term, I promise. I know you don't believe me now, but take my word for it. The Third Amendment addresses a problem raised in the Declaration. No quartering of troops in times of peace without the owner's consent. But in time of war, you're screwed, right? Congress can pass a law to let G.I. Joe stay in your house, right? That's how it works. The Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, okay, is your criminal procedure amendment. Now, lots of students say, Josh, how do I practice constitutional law? I'll tell you how. Become a criminal defense lawyer. Become a prosecutor. You will live in the Fourth, Fifth, and the Sixth Amendments. So it begins. The right of the people to be secure in their persons houses papers and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. This relates back to the swarms of hither officers searching people for taxes, right? You have protection against searches and seizures. They cannot be unreasonable. And if they want to do a search, a warrant can be issued only upon probable cause. In other words, you need a judge, some neutral magistrate, who can issue a warrant. It can't be done arbitrarily. In the English Times, you have what was called a writ of assistance. A writ of assistance, which was a general search warrant. Said, okay, you can just go search this entire town. Each warrant must be specific, based on oath or affirmation of what's to be searched. The Fifth Amendment, again, is a bit of a hodgepodge. There's lots of different clauses. I'll go through them. So you always hear to be, I plead the Fifth, right? I plead the Fifth, right? You know, what does that mean? You can't be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against yourself. You can't be required to testify against yourself. But there's more in the Fifth Amendment. That's actually one of the least important parts of the entire damn clause, right? If the government wants to charge you with a crime, they must indict you for a grand jury. What's a grand jury? It's a group of people who say, yes, there's enough evidence to go forward with this charge. In other words, a prosecutor can't just say, you know what, we're going to try you for a crime. You have to make the case to a jury of your peers, right? You have a grand jury and the petite jury, right? The grand jury is the first one, it's fairly big. Petite jury is usually 12 people, much smaller for trial. You have what's called the double jeopardy clause, that you can't be put in life or limb. You can't be subject to the same offense twice. But under current law, the federal government can prosecute you for a crime, and the state government can prosecute for the same crime. Some of these weird aspects of our system, it's called the dual sovereignty doctrine. It might actually be in flux in the next couple of years. Then here comes a biggie. The government cannot deprive you of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What does that mean? What's life? Well, they can't kill you, right? They can't execute you without due process of law. If they give you due process, they can execute you, but they got to give you that process. They can't take away your liberty. What is liberty? We'll spend the second half of the semester on that word. I'm not exaggerating. Maybe the second half of the semester on that one word. They can't take away your property. Now, what is due process of law? What's this phrase, due process of law? Well, when you say process, you think of a trial, a hearing, a judge, jury, right? The process that is due, right? What process am I due? That's due process. But does it also refer to something more than that? Are certain laws so unfair that no process will ever justify, right? I'll give you a preview of a class. What if, you have a situation where the town pulls the number of a hat. Whatever number they pull out, that's your number, you're executed. It's fair. Random number. Is that law consistent with the due process of law? What was that? Yeah, the lottery? Yeah. So that's the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment. Again, the due process clause of the Fifth Amendment only applies to Congress. Next. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This is what's known as eminent domain. That if the government wants to take your property, they can only do so for public use, and they had to pay you for it, just compensation. If you take property 2, taking it this semester?
No.
Okay, you'll take property 2 next year then, you'll learn about this clause. We'll talk about not again, unfortunately. Okay, so much stuff I wish I could talk about. I wish I could do the entire Constitution. The Sixth Amendment, more criminal procedure stuff. You have a right to a speedy trial and a public trial. You can't be carried away to a foreign place for a secret trial. That doesn't work. You have a right to an impartial jury. You can confront witnesses, and you have compulsory process to obtain evidence of witnesses in your favor, and you have the assistance of counsel. Does that mean the government pays for your attorney? Probably not originally, but under modern law, the government has to pay for your attorney in a criminal proceeding. You see the movie Gideon's Trumpet, you'll know that saga. Seventh Amendment, not too important, but you have the right to trial by jury in a civil case if the amount of controversy is $20. And though that has not been increased for inflation, it's still $20. And that was a dollar was a Spanish coin. They have silver. That's what a dollar was back then. Okay. Eighth Amendment, more criminal stuff. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Okay? What's a cruel and unusual punishment? Does that refer to punishments that were cruel and unusual in 1787? Or is it a modern, evolving standard? The court's actually taken the latter approach. Is the death penalty unconstitutional? Well, you can take someone's life if they're given due process. We go on. The Ninth and 10th Amendments are what we might call rules of construction. What do I mean by that? Remember from Contracts Expressio Unius canon, right? That if you include certain things in the list, that means other things are excluded, right? So let's say we have this Bill of Rights. You get free speech. You get, right to bear arms. You have the quartering of troops. You list, 15 or 20 rights. Are those all the rights people have? Well, you might think so, right? If you only list certain rights, it raises a presumption that that's all you got. The Ninth Amendment was designed to rebut that presumption. It says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. What does that mean? The fact that certain rights were listed, enumerated in the Constitution, does not mean that other rights which were retained by the people should be denied. Okay, that's easy enough. What are the other rights retained by the people? It doesn't say, and that's the rub, right? It says you got all the other rights, we're not going to deny them, but we're not going to tell you what they are. Can courts decide what those rights are? Can the legislature decide what those rights are? How do we know if they're actually rights retained by the people? We'll come back to it. And the 10th Amendment is a very important provision. Not so much for what it says, but for what it does. It says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What is that saying? Well, let's take it one step at a time. What powers are delegated to Congress? Article 1, section? Bingo. You know it by heart. Right? If I ask you, where does Congress get the power to Article 1, section 8, you'll be probably right 80% of the time, right? So, if a power is given to Congress in Article 1, section 8, that's federal power. States do not have it. But, comes the big but. What if a power is not listed in Article 1, section 8? Okay, then we go to the next clause. Are the states prohibited from doing it? For example, states can impair contracts, right? So, that's out. But virtually everything else, if the power is not given to Congress, who has it? It's reserved to the states. And really the people, because the people are the ultimate sovereigns in our republic. Just think about this for a minute. If the Constitution does not give a power to Congress, it's reserved to the states. Now, does the 10th Amendment actually give any powers to the states? No. It merely reflects an understanding that if it's not given to Congress, the states have it, right? So if you say, oh, such and such law violates the 10th Amendment, it's almost like a non sequitur. It's not an actual argument. You'll see this in books. People make the mistake all the time. Laws don't actually violate the 10th Amendment. What you say is, because the power is not given to the United States, the states have it. Therefore, Congress lacks the power to do something. That's the correct framework. And laws can't violate the 10th Amendment. Judges do this all the time. They know what they're talking about. You'll see this. But just if you look at the text, you can't violate the 10th Amendment. It's not possible. The point is, it's not delegated. It's a power not delegated. That's the correct framework. Again, you'll see this screwed up all the time, but we'll get there. Yeah.
You said that amendments 9 and 10 were rules.
Rules of construction. Remember how to construct a contract, how to interpret a contract? The exact same way, right? In other words, what do you do with the fact that you have certain rights listed and others not listed? We say, don't worry, they're still protected even if they're not listed, right? And what do you do with the fact that certain powers are delegated but other powers are not delegated? You know what? If it's not delegated, states retain it. It's merely a rule of interpretation of how to understand the Constitution. Way to read it. Again, the 10th Amendment was not ratified until 1791, 2 years later. We could have never had a 10th Amendment, right? There was no guarantee when the Constitution was ratified in 89 that they had a Bill of Rights. No guarantee. So we have to read the Constitution as if these don't exist. We have to read the Constitution as if the 10 Amendments were never ratified. Let me ask this question, it will be provocative. Let's say the First Amendment was never ratified. Could Congress censor the press? What enumerated power gives Congress the power to censor the press? Ooh. Go search through the Article 1, Section 8. Is there a press censorship clause? There's not. So, again, we may have never even had these first 10 amendments. They could never happen. But the question is, did Congress have the power to do it? If the answer is no, then they can't do it. States could censor the press all they want, probably. But Congress couldn't. Okay? 15 minutes to go, I'm done with the Bill of Rights, right on schedule. The other 16 amendments are varying degrees of importance, and we'll cover some of them, but most of them we will not. The 11th Amendment we'll cover in class, I think on Wednesday, we'll do a case called Chisholm versus Georgia. So the 11th Amendment imposes limits on how you can sue the state. Right, as a general matter, you can't sue the state. I'll leave it there. The 12th Amendment concerns how to elect the president. Now, if you can imagine this, under the original plan of the Constitution, you didn't have a ticket, right, where the president and the vice president run together. The way it worked is whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the second most votes was vice president. Just think about that for a second, right? You'd have President Trump and Vice President Clinton. Just think about that for a second. This proved to be a very bad idea, and it was changed. It was changed very quickly. So now you have people running on a ticket together. You don't have the president. This actually happened was President Jefferson and Vice President Aaron Burr, and they hated each other. It was a disaster. Aaron Burr was the person who killed Alexander Hamilton and then tried to start a revolution. This guy was a piece of work. All right. Okay. So then we have the 11th and 12th Amendment ratified in fairly short order, but nothing for decades. We would not have any new amendments till after the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. We often speak of the founding as 1787, right? We had two foundings in this republic. The first in 1787, and the second in the 1860s, following the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments radically changed the way our government works. Indeed, our government was unrecognizable after the Civil War. It's called Reconstruction because the government was actually reconstructing itself, basically changing itself whole. These amendments were ratified following the Civil War to correct a lot of the errors in the original Constitution. Didn't fix all of them. Don't be modest, right? But it was an attempt to remedy a lot of the deficiencies in our original Constitution. So we start with the 13th Amendment. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Again, the Constitution never used the word slaves, never used the word slavery. It did here. And it did it to abolish it immediately. We'll discuss the Emancipation Proclamation later. All that provision did was Lincoln tried to eliminate slavery in certain rebel states. But this clause eradicated it coast to coast. It shall not exist anywhere. Not only that, Congress has the power to enforce this. What does that mean? If states still permit slavery, Congress can take action to stop it. If states do things that are similar to slavery, Congress may have power to stop that also. We'll talk about this the second half of the semester. But very important provision. Now we get to the 14th Amendment. We'll probably spend half the semester on the 14th Amendment. It's a biggie, and there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I'll walk through it fairly quickly. The purpose of the 14th Amendment was to undo the Dred Scott decision, right? And to ensure that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. All persons, not just all free persons, all persons. And what happens when you're a citizen? You get rights. The debate about privileges and immunities, did they have them, did they not? All persons born or naturalized in the United States were now citizens, and then the states can abridge the privileges or immunities of those citizens. It's a 1-2 punch. You make them citizens, you give them rights, and the government can't take those rights away. In 2 sentences, you overturn Dred Scott. It's remarkable. The Supreme Court never overturned Dred Scott. It was done right here. That's where it was done in 2 sentences, right there. You'll see it clearly. But more than that, states cannot deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. Wait a minute, Josh. What about the Fifth Amendment? Due process clause. That only applies to Congress. Fifth Amendment only applies to Congress, but now the states cannot deprive people of the due process of law. And it goes beyond that. Nor shall any state deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Now, when we think of equal protection today, it means, they must treat people alike of different races. That wasn't quite how it was understood. Protection meant protection. Protection from what? Violence. The Klan. This was designed to protect people from violence. and acts of aggression based on race. It was actually the basis of a lot of legislation to protect people from the Ku Klux Klan, which was, I think, the Klan was founded about a year or two after the 13th Amendment was ratified in response to Reconstruction. Okay? So this is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, probably the most important part of the Reconstruction Amendments, probably. People disagree, but I think it's probably the most important. Next, we fix another mistake. So we have the 3/5 clause, right? Where representation is based on a whole number of free persons and 3/5 of other persons. No more. Representatives shall be apportioned based on the whole number of persons in each state, period. Period. Not just free persons, persons. This ensured that representation would be done without regard to race. Indeed, if a state deprived the freedmen, I say freedmen, the free slaves, if a state deprived the freedmen of the right to vote, they would lose representation in Congress. This is actually an important provision that doesn't get much attention, but it might in the near future. This? So the next section. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention that, right? Up to this point, the Constitution was basically gender neutral, right? The fact that these were pronoun he didn't really matter. Back then, it was gender neutral. But the suffragists were not very happy about this provision. The suffragists, women, the right to vote for women. Because it says you only have the right to vote for male citizens, not female. So this was actually the first introduction of a gender role in the Constitution, which was not very popular. Because many of the suffragists were also abolitionists, and they were not very happy with this. There was a huge, huge debate at the time about this. If you had participated in the Civil War and you engaged in insurrection, you're not going to Congress. This is important. During the Reconstruction, basically the southern states had no representation in Congress. They said, until you agree to our terms, you're out. So you have what basically we call the radical Republicans in the North. The Southerners were the Democrats, the Northern Republicans who ran the show. And they had no representation for Southerners for a couple of years. Okay? Section 4. This is a somewhat obscure provision, but it's actually very important. We already discussed that the government takes your property. They have to pay you for it, right? What about for the emancipation of slaves? There was a serious concern that plantation owners would bring compensation claims for the taking of their property. There was a legitimate, people worried about this. So Section 4 says, no money paid for the emancipation of slaves. It's right there. Very obscure provision. People don't know what it even means, but that's what they were worried about. You actually people calculating the value of the property. Okay. Now, biggie. Section 5. Congress shall have the power to enforce this provision by appropriate legislation. What does that mean? If a state deprives someone of the equal protection laws, Congress can step in. If a state deprives someone of the privileges and immunities, Congress can step in. Today we think of the 14th Amendment as being enforced by the courts, Brown versus Board, right, these decisions. But it was actually Congress that was supposed to be in the driver's seat. It was Congress supposed to enact civil rights legislation to enforce the rights protected. And they tried. As we'll say, the Supreme Court actually invalidated several of these civil rights acts. I said again, Congress tried passing a law protecting civil rights, and the Supreme Court said, no, those laws are unconstitutional. You can't do that. Those decisions, we'll discuss in the second half, in large measure led to Jim Crow. I mean, there's not a straight line, but decisions were made by the court that pushed us in a direction that didn't turn out so good. Okay? Amendment number 15. The right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of race, color, or servitude. This ensured that the freedmen were allowed to vote. Again, just men. It doesn't make any reference to gender here, but the courts held fairly quickly that women were not allowed to vote. That would come later with another amendment. And indeed, in the early years of Reconstruction, you actually had black representatives in Congress. Hiram Revels, I think his first name, I think it was from Mississippi. You actually had African-American senators. That would go away very quickly with the Jim Crow laws. But you actually had, for a brief period, a fairly robust franchise among African-Americans and the freedmen. Okay, so we're done with the Reconstruction amendments. I have 5 minutes to go. I'm right on schedule. After Amendment 15, they kind of go across the board. Amendment 16 allows Congress to impose an income tax. They needed this? Yeah. Congress tried imposing an income tax by statute. and the Supreme Court invalidated it. So they had to pass an amendment. Amendment 17 allows for direct election of senators. Remember, senators were appointed by the state legislatures. This became a very corrupt process where basically the governors and the legislatures were involved in bribery schemes to put people in Congress. Let people vote. Well, I mean, you can't get rid of money in politics, you just shift it. So the money was shifted differently. So it really made, I'm not a fan of the 17th Amendment, but I'm a bit of an outlier on that one. Okay, Amendment 18, this is the one students don't like very much. Prohibition, right? You needed an amendment to ban the importation and transportation of intoxicating liquors. Ask yourself, why do we need an amendment to ban liquor, but not an amendment to ban controlled substances? We'll get there later. Unsurprisingly, as you know, this was repealed by the 21st Amendment. I'll jump to it now. There's actually a bar in the District of Columbia called the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment. And every year they have what they call Prohibition Day, where it's repealed, they have a big party. I mean, people in D.C. don't need an excuse to drink. They really don't, but they make excuses up. Okay, that's the 18th Amendment. The 19th Amendment gave the franchise to women, the right to vote, decades later after the right to vote was given to the freedmen. The 20th Amendment changed when the president takes the oath of office. He takes the oath on January 20th. It shrunk the lame duck session. And again, the 21st Amendment eliminated prohibition. Okay. Amendment number 22. This was the Franklin Roosevelt Amendment. You cannot be president more than twice. George Washington set a precedent very early. He didn't run for a third term. And everyone abided by that until Teddy Roosevelt didn't win a third term. Franklin Roosevelt won 4 terms, so we don't have that problem anymore. The 23rd Amendment concerns electoral votes for the District of Columbia. D.C. does not have any senators or representatives, but they can send electoral votes. The 24th Amendment concerns the payment of poll taxes. That's actually a payment in order to vote. The 25th Amendment is like your the designated survivor amendment, right? What happens if the president dies, is removed? What's the process if the president becomes incapacitated? It's a fairly complicated, convoluted process. It leaves a lot of things open, and it's dangerous that it leaves things open because if there's an emergency, we're screwed. Let me put it this way. Yeah.
Do they really do that? Have a designated, so I watched that.
Yeah, no, it's true. They always keep one cabinet member home.
Shouldn't they keep somebody who's a Supreme Court home too? That have a normal-
Well, as it turns out, some of the justices don't even go anymore, so we have a couple staying behind. We'll get there later. Okay, that's Amendment 25. 26 gave the right to vote to 18-year-olds. We debate the wisdom of that maybe with this crowd. I don't know. 27. I'm sorry, and that was 26th Amendment. Oh, we're done. Yeah, spare. Wow. And the 27th Amendment was the one proposed in 1789, and it says that Congress can't increase their own pay. Any pay increase must take effect after the next election. And that is it. Thank you all so much. Thank you. I did 2 hours every year. Thank you. Thank you so much. If you have questions, please come up. So I'll see you all on Wednesday. Thank you so much.
I have a question about what you said regarding 14.
Yeah. Yeah.
First you said.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me scroll up to it.
Okay.
What's your name?
Adrian.
Hey, I'm Josh. Okay, 14. Let me scroll up a second.
I think it's